The night my daughter-in-law handed me a printed 30-day notice across the dinner table, she was smiling. Not a warm smile. The kind of smile that belongs on someone who has rehearsed something for weeks and is finally delivering it. I looked at the document, read it through once, folded it carefully, slid it into my jacket pocket, and thanked her for the lamb chops. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't push back my chair and make a scene. I didn't remind my son, who was cutting his meat with great concentration and not looking at me, of everything I had given him over the past 7 years. I just drove back to my suite downstairs, sat in the chair by the window, and began to plan. 6 weeks later, I owned the commercial unit where my son's landscaping business operated. He found out when the lease renewal arrived in the mail. The name on the new landlord's letterhead was my holding company. He called me 4 times before I picked up. That was just the beginning. My name is Raymond Callahan, and I spent 40 years in the trades in southern Ontario. General contracting, mostly residential, some light commercial work out of Burlington and the surrounding areas. I was not a wealthy man by any dramatic measure, but I was careful and I was patient. Maria and I had built something real, the way people used to build things, slowly, without shortcuts. By the time I retired at 62, we had a paid-off house in Aldershot, a reasonable pension, 2 rental properties in the East End, and investment accounts that my financial advisor described as conservative but solid. Maria passed in the spring, 2 years before I turned 60. Ovarian cancer, caught too late. After that, the house on Fairview felt wrong in ways that were hard to explain to anyone who hadn't stood in a kitchen they'd shared with someone for 31 years and made coffee alone in the morning. My son Martin and his wife Diane suggested I sell and move closer to them. They had a finished basement suite, they said. Separate entrance off the side yard, a proper kitchen, its own bathroom. I could have my own space, they said, but still be nearby, for family. I thought it sounded reasonable. I was 63 years old and recently widowed, and I didn't have better ideas. I sold the house in Aldershot for $840,000, which was more than I had expected, and I moved into the suite on the September long weekend. I paid Martin and Diane a monthly amount we never formally agreed on in writing, which was a mistake I would understand later. $800 a month. I called it a contribution, not rent, which was another mistake. I helped with things around the property because it gave me something to do. I fixed the deck railing in October. I replaced the Evastrofes the following spring. When Diane's car needed new brakes, and she mentioned it at supper, I drove it to my mechanic on Plains Road and paid the bill. None of this was unusual for me. Maria and I had always believed that family helped family, that the people you loved were worth investing in. It was how we had been raised. Martin ran a landscaping and property maintenance company that I had helped him build, Callahan Landscape and Design. In the beginning, when he had the idea but not the capital, I had given him $45,000 for a used truck and a trailer, a commercial mower, handheld equipment, insurance, and the first season's operating costs. I had also introduced him to 3 property management companies I'd worked alongside for decades, which had given him his first commercial contracts. He had built from there, and he had built it well. The business was genuinely his. He had the talent for it and the work ethic, but he had needed the foundation, and I had provided it. The commercial unit where he operated, a 2-bay space in a small industrial park off Appleby Line in Burlington, had been my find. I had known the owner of the building, a retired plumber named Gary Stanton, through a decade of overlapping work. When Martin needed a place to store equipment and set up a proper office, I had called Gary and arranged a lease at a fair rate. Martin had signed it himself and maintained it himself, and I had stepped back because that was appropriate. But it was my relationship that had opened the door. I am telling you these things not to build a case for sympathy, though I understand it may read that way. I am telling you because these things are the context for everything that followed. When you understand what a man has given, freely and without contract, you understand what it means to hand that man a 30-day notice over lamb chops on a Tuesday in February. The problems had been growing for most of the year before the notice arrived. I had been aware of them without fully naming them, There were silences that settled over the dinner table when I mentioned plans or opinions. There were small corrections from Diane, delivered with lightness, but landing with weight. The twice-weekly suppers we had shared since I moved in became once a week, then occasional. I found myself eating alone in my suite more often and telling myself this was perfectly fine, that adults did not need to eat together every night, that I was an independent person and preferred my own company. When Diane's parents, Frank and Carol Myers, began visiting more frequently the previous autumn, I noticed the shift in atmosphere without understanding its direction. Frank was a loud, cheerful man from Barrie who had worked in insurance and never quite stopped selling. Carol was quiet in the way of someone who lets other people do the work and then decides afterward what she thinks. They came down for a weekend in October, then again in November, for nearly 2 weeks that time. Diane mentioned that Frank's knees were giving him trouble on the stairs in their house in Barrie, that Carol worried about winter driving. I nodded and said that sounded difficult. I understood at supper that Tuesday night in February, when the document slid across the table, that I had been slower to understand than I should have been. Diane had typed it herself. I could tell by the font, which was slightly different from a standard legal document. 30 days written notice to vacate the basement suite. Effective March 1st. She had not had a lawyer prepare it, which I noted carefully. At the bottom, a line for my signature and a copy for each party. I need the suite for my parents, she said. They need to be closer to us. Mom's hip has been a problem for months. They need a place that's accessible. The suite has its own entrance off the side yard. It's perfect for them. And where am I supposed to go? I asked. My voice was level. We thought you might look at a senior's residence, she said. There's a lovely one on New Street, very independent living. Or some of those newer condos being built near the lake. I looked at Martin. He set down his fork, picked it up again, and cut a piece of lamb that didn't need cutting. Dad, he said, it might be nice to have your own place, your own space. He was talking to his plate. I have my own space, I said. I live downstairs. The conversation went nowhere useful after that, which was probably by design. Diane had planned the exit and provided the paperwork. There was nothing to negotiate. I pocketed my copy, thanked them, and went downstairs. In my suite, I sat in the chair by the window that looked out at the side yard, where the separate entrance path ran along the fence I had replaced last April with pressure-treated cedar. The landscaping along the path, I had planted that too, some ornamental grasses and a few junipers that would take a couple of years to fill in properly. It looked good already. I was not a man who wept easily. I had not wept when the doctor explained what was happening to Maria. I had held her hand and listened and driven home afterward and made myself a cup of tea and sat very still for a long time. That was how I processed things that hurt. I sat still and I let the information settle and I started, eventually, to think clearly. I sat still for about 20 minutes. Then I opened my laptop. The first thing I did was go to my banking applications and review everything with fresh eyes. The investment accounts, which my advisor had managed carefully for the years since Maria passed and the house sold. The pension, the 2 rental properties, one on Guelph Line and one near downtown Hamilton, both occupied by reliable tenants, generating a combined $3,100 monthly, almost without effort. The liquid savings in my checking and high-interest savings accounts. I had not counted all of it together in some time, because I had not needed to. I wrote the total on the notepad I kept by the chair. I circled it, then I sat back and studied it. I was not a man anyone at that dinner table would have thought of as significant. I was a retired contractor who drove a 7-year-old pickup truck and bought his coffee at Tim Hortons and wore the same style of jacket he had worn for 15 years. I had lived in a basement suite and paid $800 a month to my son's household and helped with repairs and did not mention money because it felt immodest to do so. Neither Martin nor Diane had ever asked what I had. Why would they? To them I understood now, an aging man who needed their hospitality. I called my lawyer, Paul Devereaux, the following morning. Paul had handled my real estate transactions for 20 years, and we understood each other well. I need a few things, I told him. A formal accounting of all financial transfers to my son over the past 7 years, documented with dates and amounts, And I want you to set up a numbered holding company under my name. Real estate acquisitions. How quickly can we do that? Paul asked if everything was all right. Things are becoming clearer, I said. That's different from being all right, but it'll do for now. I spent the first week compiling the documentation myself, because I have always been a careful record keeper. 40 years in contracting teaches you to write things down. I found the e-transfers to Martin from the original business startup. The down payment contribution I had made toward the house on Spruce Avenue, $160,000, given at a time when I had told myself and him that it was a gift, that family helped family, that I didn't want it back. I found the monthly transfers, $800, now 3.5 years of them. I found the receipts from the deck materials I had purchased myself, the Avestrifs, the brake job, total, $223,000, give or take. I wrote it out carefully, every line dated and sourced, the way I would have documented materials costs on a job site. I moved out of the suite on March 1st, exactly as the notice required. I hired 2 movers, and I was out before noon. I did not ask Martin to help, and he did not offer. I moved into a furnished short-term rental apartment in downtown Burlington, a clean 2-bedroom on Lakeshore Road with a view of the bay, and I paid 3 months in advance without hesitation. Diane had not expected that, I think. She may have expected me to argue, to delay, to make it difficult in ways that would require further confrontation. Instead, I was gone cleanly, and the suite was empty, and there was nothing to push against. I watched the lake from my new apartment window, and I drank my coffee, and I began to make calls. I had known Gary Stanton, the owner of the industrial park unit on Appleby Line, for a long time. We had crossed paths on projects across the region throughout the 90s and 2000s. Gary was 71 now and semi-retired, managing a small portfolio of commercial properties with declining enthusiasm. When I called him that second week of March, just to catch up, I mentioned I was looking at potential commercial real estate investments for my holding company. You know, Gary said, actually, I've been thinking about simplifying things. The Appleby Line unit is one I'd sell if the right offer came along. Tenants got 2 years left on the lease, but they're reliable. The tenant, of course, was my son's company. I didn't mention that. I asked Gary what he was thinking in terms of price. He gave me a number. I said I'd have Paul look at the comparables and get back to him within the week. The unit was a reasonable investment on its own merits. 2 bays, good access off a main arterial road, solid mechanicals, newer roof, put on 4 years prior. The comparable sales in the Appleby industrial corridor supported Gary's number within about 8%. I made an offer slightly below asking. Gary accepted within 2 days. We closed on April 17th. Paul handled all of it, and the title went into my numbered holding company, 741926 Ontario Incorporated. My name did not appear on the exterior correspondence. There was no reason for Martin to know, until the lease renewal notice arrived in June. I had taken to spending my mornings at a cafe on Brant Street, working through whatever reading or correspondence I had, drinking coffee that was better than Tim Hortons and more expensive, which I didn't mind. I had spent 40 years being careful about expenses because I had needed to be, and I was done being careful about coffee. I had also taken on a small consulting arrangement with a former colleague, Barry Olmsted, who was working on a mixed-use development in Oakville and wanted a second set of experienced eyes on the contractor coordination. The work was not demanding, 2 or 3 hours, a few times a week, site visits occasionally, phone consultations. It reminded me that I was still useful in ways that had nothing to do with fixing decks or paying household contributions. On the afternoon of April 28th, Martin called. He called once and I let it go to voicemail. He called again, and a third time. I set down my coffee and answered on the 4th call. Dad. His voice was strange. I'd never heard quite that note in it before. Tight, like something was compressed behind it. Did you buy Gary Stanton's building? Gary Stanton's former building, I said. Yes. There was a long silence. You bought the unit where my company operates. I did. But... He stopped. Why didn't you... I waited. Dad. He exhaled. What is happening? I'm a property investor now, I said. I've had some time to think about my assets and how I want to manage them going into my later years. The unit came available, and it made sense. You didn't say anything. You didn't ask. Another silence, longer this time. I could hear him moving, a door opening and closing, the sounds of being outside suddenly, away from where others might hear. The lease renewal, he said. It came from a numbered company. I didn't know who that was. That's my holding company. Are you going to renew it? Paul will reach out with renewal terms this week, I said. The rate will be adjusted to current market. The unit rents below market right now, which wasn't sustainable for the previous owner. We'll bring it in line. Still a fair rate. Better than what you'd find vacant in that corridor. He was quiet for a moment. Dad, this is my business, my livelihood. I know, I said. Which is why I'll make sure the terms are reasonable. You'll have a proper lease, properly documented, everything above board. I didn't know you were going to do this. You didn't ask, I said again. Is there anything else you need? He hung up. I finished my coffee, left a fair tip, and walked out onto Brant Street in the mild April afternoon. Burlington was doing what it did in spring, thawing into color slowly, the lake still gray, but the trees beginning to show along the waterfront. I walked down to the water and sat on a bench and watched a pair of Canada geese argue about something near the marina. I was not triumphant. That is an important distinction I want to make. Triumph is for competitions where someone is losing. What I felt sitting on that bench was something more like restoration. The sensation of standing in a space that was properly mine again, rather than one I had gradually given away without intending to. Martin came to my apartment the following Saturday morning. I had expected this, and I had bought a proper coffee maker in anticipation of the conversation. Not because I wanted to soften anything, but because I am a man who believes in providing decent coffee. He arrived at 9:15. I had seen more of the strain in him over those weeks since March. Even from a distance, he was thinner than he had been at Christmas. He sat at my kitchen table and accepted the coffee I poured without comment. Dad, he said, I need to understand what's happening. I sat across from him, the same table between us that had been in Maria's kitchen on Fairview for 20 years. The one piece of furniture I had kept when I sold the house. What would you like to understand? You moved out. You bought the building where my company is. You haven't returned Diane's calls. She's been trying to reach you. I know. I've been choosing not to speak with her right now. He looked at me steadily for a moment. That was something new. The boy who had avoided eye contact at the dinner table in February had found something since then. Some resource of directness. I noted it. She feels like you're punishing her. I'm not punishing anyone, I said. I'm managing my affairs. I'm reorganizing my finances into structures that actually protect me. That's what a 64-year-old man with assets should be doing. By buying the building my business is in, that building is a good investment on its own merits. The tenant history is solid. The location is good. If your company weren't there, I'd find another tenant who would be. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. He has a habit of doing that when he's thinking, turning things in his hands. He got it from Maria. We made a mistake, he said quietly. With the 30-day notice. How it was done, I repeated. I let the words sit. Diane handled it. I should have. I should have talked to you myself, explained what we were thinking, figured out something better. You could have told her not to hand me a printed notice at supper. I know. You could have said something at that table. He nodded, looking down at his coffee. I know I should have. I was taking the easy way out, and it wasn't right. I had rehearsed many versions of this conversation in my head over the past 2 months. In some of them, I was harder. In some, I said things I had never said to him in his life, things that had accumulated quietly over the years in the way that unexpressed truths do. But looking at him across my kitchen table, in the apartment where I had been living alone since March, I found I was not interested in the version where I wounded him as deeply as I could. He was my son. He had made serious errors in judgment, and he had let his wife manage a situation that he should have managed himself. Both of those things were true. But he was also the person Maria and I had loved completely for 38 years, and whatever had gone wrong between us had not canceled that. "You helped me build everything I have, Dad," he said. "The company, the house. You were there every time I was in over my head. And I let you get handed a notice to vacate your home." "It wasn't your home either," I said. "That was Diane's choice of words, not mine. The suite was my home for 3.5 years, and I was a good tenant who paid on time and contributed to the property." "That's exactly what I mean." I let him sit with that for a moment. "What are Diane's parents doing?" I asked. "Are they settled in the suite?" "They moved in mid-March," he said. "Frank's knee surgery is scheduled for July in Hamilton. There's a lot of people in the house. You're supporting 2 additional adults in your home. We're not charging them rent." "I see. We probably should be," he said, and I heard in that the kind of clarity that comes from paying for things that have stopped being abstract. I told him what I had told myself in that chair by the window the night I read the notice, that I had given freely because I had wanted to, because I believed in family, because Maria and I had come from people who helped their own, that I had never counted it as debt, that I had not walked around with a ledger tracking every dollar. But when I had needed something in return, something as basic as being treated with dignity in a home I had helped purchase, in a family I had helped build, I had received a printed form and a dinner table smile. He was quiet for a long time after I said that. "What do you need from me?" he asked finally. "2 things," I said. "First, I need a real conversation with Diane, not a coerced apology, not something you've negotiated for me in advance. A real conversation in which she acknowledges what happened and takes responsibility for it. If she can't do that, then you and I will manage a distant but civil relationship, and that will be what we have. And the second thing? I'm not restoring the monthly contributions. They're done. That chapter is finished. Your company will pay market rent for the unit, properly documented on a proper lease, and we will have a landlord-tenant relationship that is professional and fair. The business help is done in the way it was being done. You're 38 years old, and you've built a real company, and you don't need me propping up your household expenses. That was making you smaller than you are." He nodded slowly, absorbing this. He turned his coffee cup one more time. "I don't want to lose you," he said. "We don't want to lose you. I don't know if Diane is there yet, but I am. I'm there." "Then give her time to get there," I said. "And give yourself credit for showing up here today. That was not a small thing." He left an hour later. Steadier than when he'd arrived, I thought. I stood at my apartment window and watched him walk to his truck in the parking lot below, a man in his late 30s carrying weight that was making him figure out who he was. I had carried weight at his age too. I recognized the posture. The weeks that followed settled into a routine. I continued my consulting work with Barry. I had lunch twice with Paul to go over the holding company filings and to discuss whether the Hamilton rental might be worth upgrading before the current tenant's lease ended in autumn. Paul thought the numbers supported a modest renovation that would increase the monthly by $300. We agreed to proceed. Martin and I texted occasionally, briefly, things about the Leafs and the weather, the low-stakes currency of men who are rebuilding something and know better than to rush it. He told me Frank's surgery had been moved to June. I said I hoped it went smoothly and meant it. I have nothing against Frank and Carol individually. They are ordinary people who found themselves accommodated by their daughter at another man's expense. They didn't draw up the notice. They just unpacked their suitcases into the empty room. In late May, Barry and I drove out to the Oakville site on a clear morning to walk the framing with the project manager, a sharp young woman named Andrea, who had every detail memorized and didn't need either of us, though she was gracious about the consultation. On the drive back, Barry asked how I was settling into apartment life. "Better than expected," I said honestly. "I've got a good view of the water." "You seem different," Barry said. "Good different. Like you finally remembered you've got money." I laughed, which surprised me. "I've always known I had money," I said. "I just forgot it was mine to use." On a Tuesday afternoon in early June, I was at my kitchen table reviewing some contractor quotes Barry had forwarded when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, which I normally let go to voicemail. I answered it. It was Diane. "Raymond," she said. Her voice was formal in the way of someone who has been sitting with something for a while and has decided to say it cleanly. "I'd like to speak with you in person, if you're willing. Not through Martin, just us." I told her I was willing. We arranged to meet at a cafe on Martha Street the following Thursday at 2. I will tell you honestly that I did not know what to expect. I had seen the spectrum of what people do when they've behaved badly and the consequences have arrived. Some get defensive. Some perform contrition without meaning it. Some find, in the experience of actual loss, something that breaks them open into sincerity. I didn't know which version of Diane I would be sitting across from. She was already there when I arrived, seated at a corner table with a tea she hadn't touched. She looked tired in a way that was different from the composed, organized woman who had handed me a printed form in February. Something had worn on her. The crowded house, probably. The surgery logistics. The lease renewal from a numbered company she hadn't seen coming. The husband who had started, from what I could read between the lines of Martin's texts, to actually say things he believed instead of the things that were easiest. I sat down. I ordered coffee. I waited. "I've been trying to figure out how to have this conversation for 2 months," she said. "I've started it in my head probably 50 times. "Take your time," I said. She looked at me directly, which I respected. "I prepared that notice without thinking about what I was actually doing to you. I was thinking about logistics, my parents, the space, the timing. I had convinced myself it was practical and therefore fine." She paused. "I didn't think about the fact that you're a person who'd built a life in our home, who'd been generous to us in ways I think I managed to stop seeing." I let her continue. "Martin and I have had a lot of difficult conversations since you moved out," she said, "about money and what you contributed and what I think I took for granted." She shook her head slightly. "I'm not going to list all of it, because it'll sound like I'm reciting something I rehearsed. But I want you to know that I understand now, more than I did, what it cost you to be treated the way I treated you. And I'm genuinely sorry. That's not for Martin. I wanted to say it myself." I looked at her for a moment before I answered. I believed her. Not completely, not without reservation, the way you believe someone you've known for 30 years without complication. But I believed that she was doing her honest best in this moment, and that is all anyone can do. "I appreciate you saying it yourself," I said. "That mattered." She nodded, hands around her teacup. "I want to be clear about where things stand," I said, "because I think clarity is more useful right now than any version of everything going back to the way it was." She looked at me steadily. "Okay, I'm not going to be a financial backstop for your household anymore. Not for you and Martin, not for your parents' costs, not for any of it. The monthly contributions are done. The business rent will be at market rate and on a proper lease. Those aren't punishments. They're just how things should have been structured from the beginning, and I should have structured them that way myself. That's my responsibility to own." She didn't flinch. I think she had been expecting this. "Martin and I have both learned some things this spring," she said, "about what we can actually manage on our own." She paused. "My parents will be going back to Barrie after Frank's surgery is done. We've had that conversation." "How did that go?" I asked. About as well as you'd expect," she said. I had a very brief sympathy for that conversation, which I did not express out loud. We talked for another 40 minutes, not resolving anything dramatic, but talking, the way people do when they've decided to stop performing and try honesty instead. She told me that Martin had started getting up earlier, that he was at the shop by 6:30 most mornings, that something had shifted in how he approached the business since the spring, a seriousness she described as new, though I thought it might simply be visible now in a way it hadn't been before. I told her about the consulting work, about Barry's Oakville project, about the Hamilton property renovation I was planning. She seemed genuinely interested, which was perhaps the thing that surprised me most. When we stood to leave, she looked at me and said, "Do you think there's a way back to something? Not what we had, because I don't think that was actually good for anyone, but something." "I think so," I said. "I think that's what today was." She nodded. "Martin would like you to come for dinner sometime, when you're ready. No pressure on the timing." "Tell him I'll call him this week," I said. I walked back to my car on a warm June afternoon, past the shop fronts and the summer planters along Martha Street, and I sat for a minute before I started the engine. The city moved around me, ordinary and indifferent. People buying groceries and checking their phones and living their Tuesday afternoons. I was 64 years old, and I had just had a difficult and honest conversation with my daughter-in-law, and my son was calling me to arrange dinner, and I owned a commercial property on Appleby Line and 2 residential rentals and a view of Lake Ontario from my kitchen window. Maria would have asked me, walking in from the garden in the evenings with dirt on her gloves, whether I had handled things well. That was always her question. Not did you win? Not did they apologize enough? Did you handle it well? I thought I had. Mostly. I called Martin that evening. He picked up on the second ring. Diane said you might call, he said. I'd like to come for dinner sometime in the next couple of weeks, I said. If that still works. There was a pause, and in it, something that I recognized as relief. The particular exhale of someone who has been braced against a possibility that has now lifted. Yeah, Dad. Yeah, of course it does. We settled on a Saturday, 2 weeks out. No occasion, just dinner. I told him I'd bring a decent bottle of wine, and he told me that sounded good. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment as the evening came in off the lake, the water turning the particular shade of silver gray that Burlington gets in June when the sun starts to go sideways across it. I thought about the way things shift, not always forward in a straight line, but forward nonetheless, the way a building settles over decades into its foundation without anyone watching. The following Monday, I called Paul and told him I wanted to look at some additional properties. Nothing rushed. I wanted to be considered about it. Look at what made sense in the current environment. Focus on the corridor between Burlington and Hamilton, where I had the most local knowledge. Paul said that was smart and that he had a few things worth looking at. I also called Barry and told him I'd be able to take on slightly more of the Oakville coordination through the summer, if the project timeline supported it. He said it did, and that he was glad I had the bandwidth. He said the young project manager Andrea had mentioned me specifically in a site meeting and used the word thorough, which was the highest compliment in my trade. In late August, Martin and I walked the site of a potential landscaping contract together, a large residential property in Oakville whose owner had contacted his company about a full-season maintenance arrangement, plus some significant planting work in the fall. I had come along not as his financial backer or his advisor, but because he had asked if I wanted to see the scope of work, the way you might ask a parent or a colleague whose eye you trust. I walked the property with him and his foreman, a quiet man named Reuben, who had been with the company for 4 years. I kept my mouth shut until Martin asked me directly what I thought of the grading on the east side of the lot, near the property line, and I told him honestly that it looked like it shed water toward the neighbor's fence line and might need correction before any planting went in along that edge. Reuben nodded and said he'd been thinking the same thing. On the drive back to Burlington, Martin said, without preamble, I've been thinking about the lease on the Appleby unit. What about it? I want a longer term, 3 years minimum. It's better for the business to have stability, and I think it's probably better for your investment too, having a reliable tenancy locked in. I thought about that. He was right on both counts. A 3-year lease from an established tenant with a track record improved the asset profile. It was also, I noted, the first time he had brought a business matter to me as a peer and not a benefactor. He was not asking for a favor. He was proposing terms. Have Paul draw up the paperwork, I said. 3 years at the current rate, with a standard annual adjustment clause indexed to CPI. That's reasonable for both sides. Yeah, he said. Yeah, that's fair. We drove for a while without talking, the way we sometimes used to on job sites, when I took him along as a teenager, comfortable in the cab of a truck, watching the highway. I'm going to buy the business off its feet, Dad, he said eventually. I mean properly. I've been thinking about what it would take to do that without any outside help. Meaning without mine. Meaning by building it right. He kept his eyes on the road. I've been lazy about some of the business structure. You always made it easier not to deal with that. That wasn't your fault. It was mine for letting it happen. What are you going to change? He told me. It was a detailed, realistic plan, the kind that comes from someone who has sat with the numbers honestly And I listened to all of it and asked 2 questions and kept my other questions to myself. He didn't need my commentary. He needed me to hear him. "That sounds solid," I said when he finished. "You think so?" "I do. The piece about formalizing the equipment depreciation schedule is something you should have done 3 years ago, but better late than correct than later and still wrong." He laughed, a short, genuine laugh. "That's more or less what my accountant said. Listen to your accountant." I'm starting to. I had dinner with them on Saturdays now, most weeks. Not every Saturday, and not with the studied performance it had sometimes felt like in the years when I lived in the suite. Just dinner. Frank and Carol had gone back to Barry in late July, the week after Frank's surgery, when his recovery had stabilized enough that Diane's mother felt she could manage at home. The house on Spruce Avenue had exhaled, I imagined, the way houses do when they have been too full for too long. I did not move back into the suite. That was not something I was interested in. I had a life in my apartment on Lakeshore Road that was entirely my own, and I had found, to my honest surprise, that I liked it. I liked the quiet of it. I liked choosing what was in my refrigerator and when the television was on and where things were placed. I liked the morning coffee at my kitchen table, with the lake visible beyond the glass, and I liked the afternoon walks along the waterfront that I took when the consulting work was done for the day, and I had time that belonged to no one but me. I liked being, at 64, a man who had been tested and had held his own shape. Maria used to say that the most important thing about how you handled a hard thing was not how it looked to other people. It was whether you could look at yourself afterward, in the ordinary light of an ordinary morning, and say, yes, I did what needed doing, and I did it without losing who I am. She was talking about work disputes and difficult clients and the 1,000 small crises of a contracting life, but I think she meant it more broadly, as she usually did. I sat at my kitchen table one September morning and looked at the lake and thought about that. The geese were moving south. The light had that early autumn quality, softer and more horizontal, the kind that makes the ordinary things around you look like they've been arranged by someone thoughtful. I had a call later with Paul about the Hamilton renovation progress. After that, I was driving out to Oakville to walk the site with Andrea and Barry to look at the mechanical rough-in that the contractor had completed. And on Saturday, I was having dinner with Martin and Diane. Nothing special, just dinner. The accounting was not finished. The feelings of the man who had sat in a basement suite chair on a February night and read a 30-day notice were not fully resolved into something comfortable, and perhaps they never would be completely. But things were moving in the right direction, slowly and honestly, which in my experience is the only direction that holds. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and set it in the drying rack the way I always did. I had things to do. I went and did them. If this story resonated with you, I'd appreciate a like on the video. Subscribe to Shattered Vengeance so you don't miss what comes next. And leave a comment telling me what time it is where you are right now. I read every one.